The roar of the Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jet echoed across the airfield as it spiraled into a daring barrel roll, the tip of its wing brushing a tree branch dangerously close to the ground. Thousands of spectators gasped in awe, unaware of the mounting chaos inside the cockpit. The pilot screamed, "This isn't a stunt!" Words that would soon herald the deadliest airshow disaster in history. Welcome to our channel, where ambition meets disaster and stories leave you on the edge of your seat. Today, we uncover the deadliest airshow tragedy in history, a day of chaos, heartbreak, and lessons the world will never forget. Let's dive into the story that changed aviation forever. The celebration. The morning at Lviv Airfield had been jubilant. To commemorate the anniversary of its 14th Air Corps, the Ukrainian military organized an extravagant air show. The highlight of the day was the performance of the Sukhoi Su-27, a marvel of aviation engineering renowned for stunts like the Pugachev's Cobra. It was to be a grand display of national pride, with over 8,000 spectators, including families and military officials, gathered to watch. Yet, beneath the surface of the festivities, cracks in the event's planning were beginning to show. Volodymyr Topanar, a highly experienced pilot with nearly 3 decades of service, had requested practice runs to familiarize himself with the airfield's layout. His request was denied due to budget constraints. Reassured by his extensive experience and military intelligence briefings, Topar agreed to proceed. However, the day's chaotic organization would soon prove disastrous. The warning signs. On the morning of the event, organizers made a last-minute decision to switch the show's location to the opposite side of the airfield. This included moving the spectator zones and altering flight paths. Neither Topanar nor his co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov, were informed of these changes. Local pilots, familiar with the airfield, had raised concerns about the poor organization, with one even pulling out of the show entirely. Yet, the event pressed on, prioritizing spectacle over safety. As the show began, Topar focused on the finale, a series of aerobatic maneuvers culminating in a low pass over the crowd. However, as the Su-27 approached the airfield, it became clear that the layout didn't match their flight plans. The pilots couldn't locate the audience until it was too late. They were positioned on the opposite side of the airfield, directly in the plane's path. The disaster, flawlessly executing loops and rolls until disaster struck. During a half-barrel roll, the jet's engines lost thrust, causing its speed to drop significantly. The aircraft descended to 200 meters before attempting to pull up into a loop. This maneuver, intended to run parallel to the crowd, instead placed the jet on a collision course with the spectators. As the jet exited the loop, it was too low to regain altitude. Topar fought to control the aircraft, but the left wing clipped a tree branch, sending the plane veering toward the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed they might recover as the jet skimmed just above the ground. But it was too late. The Su-27 struck a parked transport plane, cartwheeling into the crowd in a fiery explosion. Shrapnel, jet fuel, and even barbed wire ripped through the terrified spectators. Families scrambled to escape, but the chaos was overwhelming. When the wreckage finally came to a stop, the devastation was unimaginable. 77 people were dead, and 543 were injured, many of them children. Survivors wandered the airfield in shock, searching for loved ones amid the carnage. The aftermath. In the weeks following the tragedy, grief turned into widespread outrage. The public demanded answers, and investigations soon revealed a web of systemic failures. The event had been riddled with poor planning and glaring safety violations. Pilots, including Topar and Yegorov, were provided with incorrect information about the placement of the crowd and the layout of the airfield. The critical mismatch between the planned routine and the actual environment set the stage for disaster. Compounding the issue, the Sukhoi Su-27 jet, an aging relic of Ukraine's Soviet-era military fleet, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure mid-flight. Investigators confirmed that its engines had lost thrust during a crucial maneuver. Maintenance records showed the aircraft was in poor condition, part of a fleet where only 15% of planes were considered fit for operation. Despite these findings, little effort was made to uncover why such a critical failure occurred. Claims by Topar that he had reported the jet's issues during the flight, only to be instructed by ground control to continue, were largely dismissed. Yet, instead of addressing these systemic flaws, blame fell almost entirely on the pilots. Vladimir Topar, with 27 years of impeccable service, was painted as reckless and accused of attempting dangerous maneuvers at low altitude. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Yuri Yegorov, his co-pilot, received an 8-year sentence. Additional military officials were charged with negligence and violations of flight rules, but their punishments were comparatively lenient. Most received suspended sentences or were released early, while Topar alone bore the full weight of the consequences. The conditions of Topar's imprisonment and life after release were particularly harsh. Having served his entire sentence, he emerged into a life marked by crippling fines and restrictions. Banned from operating any vehicles, including bicycles, he relied on rollerblades to commute to work. He was required to report to authorities monthly and faced a seemingly insurmountable debt. Meanwhile, the systemic flaws that led to the tragedy remained largely unaddressed, and many senior officials involved in the event returned to their posts. The victims and their families faced their own struggles. The government allocated only the equivalent of $200,000 to compensate all affected families, a sum woefully inadequate for the scale of the disaster. Payments were inconsistent and appeared random, with some families receiving as little as $7,000, while others were granted up to $40,000. Injured survivors received even less. A 4-year-old child, found traumatized among the bodies of the deceased, was awarded just $2,000 despite requiring long-term care for speech and developmental issues. The emotional toll on survivors was immeasurable. Families who had come to the air show for a day of celebration left shattered. Parents who had brought their children to witness the marvels of aviation returned home childless. Children were orphaned, and countless lives were forever altered. For many, the psychological scars were as devastating as the physical ones. Survivors described haunting memories of the wreckage, the cries of the injured, and the eerie silence that followed the explosion. Some remain unable to discuss the events of that day without reliving the trauma. Public outcry also focused on the broader systemic negligence that had allowed such an event to proceed under unsafe conditions. Air show guidelines, established to prevent exactly this type of catastrophe, had been blatantly ignored. Aircraft were flown directly over the crowd, violating basic safety protocols. Spectators were placed dangerously close to the action, with no clear escape routes in case of emergency. There was little accountability among the event organizers or senior military officials. The president of Ukraine at the time promised swift justice, but for many, the measures taken fell short. The final investigative report was never made public, leaving many unanswered questions about the true causes of the disaster. Critics argued that the focus on punishing individuals like Topar allowed the military and government to avoid scrutiny for their role in the tragedy. The disaster at Lviv airfield remains a grim reminder of the consequences of negligence and poor planning. For the victims, their families, and the survivors, the scars of that day run deep. While air shows worldwide have since adopted stricter safety measures, the legacy of systemic failure and misplaced accountability in Lviv serves as a cautionary tale. True justice may never have been served, but the hope remains that the lessons learned will prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The legacy. The tragedy at Lviv airfield remains a sobering reminder of the consequences of negligence. For the victims and their families, the scars run deep. Survivors still struggle with the emotional and physical toll of that day, and the memory of the disaster lingers as a cautionary tale. While air shows around the world have since adopted stricter safety measures, the legacy of systemic failure and misplaced accountability in Lviv serves as a stark lesson. True justice remains elusive, but the hope is that the lessons learned will prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into history's deadliest airshow tragedy. If this story gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales of ambition, disaster, and the lessons that shape our world. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, every story has something to teach us. Until next time, take care.